podcast and YouTube blog covering the German startup scene with news, interviews, and live events.
We are 35 minutes later than we originally wanted to start, but therefore we have a fresh presentation. Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of the European Startup Pulse, together again with Thomas. Hey, how you doing?
Hi, Joe. I'm doing fine. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, thank you. And we may tell our audience that we had a lot of fun preparing all of that. Admittedly, we want to start like almost 40 minutes ago. Then you have been stuck in a workshop. Then we had to adjust the presentation. But now we are going full energy because today we are talking about what a healthy startup ecosystem, startup hub, speaking about the size of a city, of a large city, is, good examples, and how one can maybe recreate all of that, right?
Yes, and that's super exciting. That's what I do for a living at Deep Ecosystems. We work with hubs all around the world to help them to create healthy ecosystems. No, because healthy is for us the most important. It's more important than having big unicorns and having the highest amount of venture capital. Now it's important that ecosystems are healthy and that it produce innovation for society, for improving the environment, fighting climate change and societal problems. So I think that's equally important than just creating big startups. So we're really looking for regional ecosystems that are healthy and can create innovation in the local space as well, not only in, let's say, the global space in Silicon Valley.
That is pretty cool. And everybody who didn't get it yet, you can one can hire you guys. I would assume usually you are hired by a public body, meaning the city, the state, or the federal government of countries. Maybe
no, that's the beauty. We actually work also with entrepreneurs because we have an accelerator for ecosystems. So if you are an entrepreneur and you like to change the region you live in into an ecosystem, into a thriving ecosystem, then you should come to Deep Ecosystems and join our accelerator to build an ecosystem in your region. That's sometimes more fun than moving away and trying your luck in London. So maybe you want to create the ecosystem at home. That's what Deep Ecosystem helps you with.
Sounds pretty good. So let's dive right in how you guys are actually doing this. And by the way, that is actually the reason you are collecting all of this data. You're digging through all of this data for more than 100, maybe even 200 cities across Europe. And that's where you get your know-how from.
Exactly. Through the data analysis and, of course, also personal experience of working with many dozens of ecosystems now and seeing what works and what doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good. So let's dive right in.
Yes, maybe that's also a good starting point, showing a bit of the ecosystems that we have been working in from Chile to Estonia, Munich and Portugal. So our team at Deep Ecosystems really is experienced. We even have a head mentor that created an accelerator program in Iran. So we are very well versed in reading and understanding ecosystems. We have been part of ecosystems all around the world, and we have intimate knowledge about how these ecosystems grew. So that combined with our data analysis of over more than 100 ecosystem metrics where we benchmark different cities and how they grow their ecosystem, that gives us a lot of experience and possibilities to help your hub, if you're building an ecosystem hub, to grow. And with our accelerator in the last 12 months, we have raised more than 1 million euros in ecosystem funding for new ecosystem initiatives. So those 25 ecosystem projects are hands-on examples of how that capability of data analysis, ecosystem building experience, network, community can come together in an accelerator to boost ecosystems in regions that maybe you have not yet heard of, but that are also innovative. So we're really about that bottom-up grassroots ecosystem building. And I think that's also what is important, because if you look at the big ecosystems in the world and you think they have always been there was never another player on top, you're wrong. No? Many of the big ecosystems today, they have started small. They have been created from the bottom up. I always love to show these 3 examples because I think they are really telling. Now, if you look at Station F, it was created by a blogger, someone that was writing about startups initially on a blog, pretty similar to you, actually, Joe. So you maybe are also the founder of a future ecosystem hub that will be world renowned soon. So watch out, I think.
I actually just gotten feedback from Northern Africa the last week. Somebody sent me a direct message on Twitter and said, here in North Africa, you're inspiration for many people. And I was going, awesome.
Very nice, very nice. In fact, we had a project recently in Morocco, measuring the ecosystem health of the startup scene in Morocco, and it was quite exciting. It's very nascent in terms of investments, but there's a lot of things happening, a lot of creative people coming together in coding schools, in co-working spaces, incubators. So there is something happening. It's exciting.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We also see Brad Feld, founder of Techstars, and one of our guests indirectly, Helmut Schönenberger, founder of Unternehmertum. We did not talk to him directly, but we talked to the current CEO of Unternehmertum, so to say, the person that followed Mr. Schönenberger.
Exactly. So, I mean, this is an exciting story as well. If you look at Munich, we will look at it a bit later in the session today. Munich hasn't been a startup hub of global rank all the time. In the last 10 years, it had a astronomical rise, and Munich has been put on the world map of startups with a lot of unicorns being here, more than 1 billion euros in funding every year. So Unternehmertum had a large part to play in this. But when it was started, Helmut was a PhD candidate. He studied for his PhD. He went to the US. He saw entrepreneurship centers there at Stanford University. And he came back to Munich and said, I want to create an entrepreneurship center at the Technical University of Munich. Can we get this done? And he was a PhD student, an entrepreneur that was pitching and convincing in the end sponsors and partners to chip in. So also here, this was created bottom up. Without those entrepreneurs, nothing would be emerging. No, you wouldn't have these ecosystems without the entrepreneurs at the center.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. That is something I see. And I totally believe that those first generation entrepreneurs are important for the second generation, meaning those people, for example, in Berlin and Munich who already have made an exit. They are most of the time very active as business angels and not only bringing money to the table, but also a lot of relevant experience. And I do believe that's very important.
Exactly. And many of them are not even able to invest because they haven't made a big exit. When they start to create the ecosystem, what they are able to do is to put together really a community and create the scene which allows entrepreneurs to grow. So, for example, here we have Brad Feld that started out in Boulder, Colorado, which is a small college town. And almost no one remembers that Techstars, one of the largest accelerators in the world today, was created in that small place where everything spoke against an accelerator to be born there, right? So it was definitely not the center of the innovation world. It's not that this is the college or university town where you had a lot of Nobel Prize winners or anything. Now, it was not known for that. Yet, this budding entrepreneur, Brad Feld, he came there, brought together the community, created an accelerator with the right mindset, and that enabled Boulder to actually grow an innovation ecosystem that to this day is punching way above its weight and is producing a lot of startups.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How did he do it?
Thanks for that question. That leads, he basically answered that himself because Brad Feld is a very outspoken entrepreneur and he put together his learnings from that experience in the Boulder thesis. Many of you listeners probably have heard of it. There's also the book Startup Communities that he wrote about this. He has set up 4 points in this thesis where he says they are important. First, entrepreneurs must lead the startup community. It must come from the entrepreneurs, not from the corporates, not from the government, not from the university. The entrepreneurs themselves must invest themselves in creating an entrepreneurship ecosystem, and they must bet also their career on this. No? So the leaders must have a long-term commitment. They must say, if I help to build that ecosystem, the startups will also carry me up, and they will also ensure my financial well-being over time. Because if we all grow this ecosystem here and startups will become successful, there's also the possibility for me to make a living of this. So this long-term commitment over 20, 30 years by the leaders is very important to Brett Feld. And he was also very, he's pushing for diversity. The startup community must include of anyone who want to participate in it. So I think initially this was much about different backgrounds, educational backgrounds, business students with engineers, lawyers, etc. But of course also this speaks to the diversity of different migrant backgrounds, sexual orientation, or what you can think of. So really anyone that wants to participate in the startup scene should be welcome and should contribute, because, and that's what also we as Deep are very much convinced about, is that these different experiences that come together in the ecosystem, they create the mix that allow really unique innovation to emerge. If you always stay in your kind of line of thinking, then nothing new emerges. So diversity is really an important ingredient in creating a startup ecosystem. Yeah, and finally, the last point is that the startup community must have continual activities that engage the entire entrepreneurial stack. So really, you can't just stop at working with developers. You also need to work with business. You need to talk about the business issues. If you have science, that needs to be involved, the legal aspects, the venture capital aspect. So you need to really think of what is needed to create a startup ecosystem. So who else do I need to pull in? I cannot just stop at, let's say, the student side. I also need to bring in the elements that are needed for creating a startup company in the later stages. So I think that's what the Boulder thesis is all about. Mm-hmm.
When you talk about lawyers, of course, what comes to mind are also the tax advisors. Never forget that aspect. I would also maybe add, try to stay away from current political funding, because the political cycles are the same across most of the world. And basically within 4 or 5 years, your complete funding could dry up, as we've seen in just a recent case where NGO was working for the UK government and basically just got pulled the plug.
Oh yeah, Tech Nation. That's bad. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you see the same in Germany now. Next year, the Exist funding for university incubators is ending. So 120 university incubators are out of funding in 2024. I don't know if that's the intention of creating ecosystems. Of course, I mean, government funding should not always be your lifeline. But of course, if you create something new, you have to have a long-term commitment and cannot decide after 10 years now I close it down. So that's a problem. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I understand.
Yes. So there's a couple of questions that we, for example, always ask to match with this Boulder thesis when we work with ecosystems. So when we talk about startup community is led by entrepreneurs. So for example, in your accelerators and incubators, are mentors, are they entrepreneurs, or are they employees at a corporate, or are they government employees, or did they have own entrepreneurial experience? Very important basic setup, right? How many of the program organizers that run the ecosystem can live off their work? Now, do they have a salary that makes them do this full time? Or is it only a hobby? Now, do we try to create our ecosystem in our region as a hobby? Now, if it's a hobby, maybe we're not professional enough and we can't expect much of it. Now, so the question is, do we have professional people building the ecosystem? Now, and also diversity. Do we have the minorities represented in the community, or are we all the same? So also community. How many people are coming to our events? Now, it's important to not just organize events, but also be honest with ourselves. Are they working? Do we get people here? Do we have momentum? Right. So it's important that we check ourselves. And from these conversations that we have developed a system that I want to show you, which we call the minimum viable ecosystem, right? So how do you create an ecosystem if you have nothing?
For our audience who just listens to this, go to www.startuprad.io. There is a link to our blog on Medium, and there you will find under the same name of this episode, how to build a startup hub. You'll also find the presentation with all the graphics. Sorry, go ahead, Thomas.
Yeah, thank you. And that's cool because I love that graphic. It has this nice little heart inside that is beating, and that is making the ecosystem move forward. So I think we did a good job on that graphic. So we have 4 elements, like we have the 4 chambers in the heart. So we are looking at the purpose of the ecosystem, like do the common belief that the people we bring together in our ecosystem have. I mean, that doesn't have to be like something crazy. No? At some point, I talked to the ecosystem in Morocco, actually, and what they said is, we just don't want to work in the old, boring economy. We want to work in the new economy. We love to work in a more creative setting. And that is a common belief. That is like a phenomenon that you see. People want to work in the new and creative economy, not in the old and boring, right? They want to have purpose. So that's important, and an important aspect in ecosystem building. So what is the purpose you have? What brings your stakeholders together? Maybe it is to become rich, to build unicorns. Then probably if you have that common goal, you can have a great community, no? If you all work into that direction. If you have different ideas, someone wants to save the world from climate change, that's a different story, right? So you will walk in a different direction. So I'm not judging anyone. I'm just saying that if you build your ecosystem, you should be clear about your purpose, because it's a big effort, and you should know where you're going.
Exactly. And just to be sure that that purpose is for the overall hub, for the overall ecosystem, however large you will define it. It's not the purpose statement of a single startup. Most of the startups, by the way, should fit in there, but it's for the complete ecosystem, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that ecosystems start small normally. No? So, of course, some people put the tag ecosystem on everything and say, we have an ecosystem that's worldwide. Yeah, maybe. I believe that most of the time, an ecosystem that really has these kind of features that make it function starts relatively small. No? So we're talking about a few dozen people rather than hundreds and thousands, right? So otherwise, I think it's also getting a little bit out of hand.
I would have one question when you talked about like all those people. Of course, in the beginning, it could be very small, but what is the approximate size you talk about in an average ecosystem? Everybody has in mind the big Silicon Valley with Google, with Meta. Maybe even you can count Amazon in, you definitely count PayPal in, and a lot of other startups there, Salesforce that became big. Where do you see the average size of an ecosystem?
Yeah, so I think geographically, the city level is what makes most sense. When we talk about innovation ecosystems, we normally look at the city level. It might make sense to go a bit smaller if you talk about universities and say, okay, it's centered around that university. But I would always think that, let's say, most actors would reference the city level. The country level already is a bit too large, because I think that the connections between actors are losing in intensity and density as well. So you don't see as much close interaction on a country level as on the city level. So my feeling is city level is the right approach. And I think that the ecosystems consist, well, of course, it can go higher in terms of very big and large ones, but it's still relatively small. So I think hundreds up to thousands in terms of individuals that are active inside the ecosystem is the right perspective.
That includes all the people working for the startups, as well as those people engaged, like talking accelerators, incubators, VCs, but also the people who organize the meetups. And I assume you don't count in like every support staff, I would call it, like lawyers, tax advisors, and all the other infrastructure that should have been in place before.
Yeah, I think that not everyone needs to be counted. It also doesn't make sense, let's say, to count people to measure the size. For example, if you have a larger startup that has then hundreds of employees, they are not normally part of the ecosystem. They work at a company and they do their job, but they are not necessarily involved in that flow of resources and exchange of activities inside the ecosystem. So I think here we are rather looking at the entrepreneurs themselves, the founders, the support organizations, the investors. Yes, also the lawyers that work directly with founders, that engage maybe on a special relationship with them. So I would say these are definitely part of it. They can be even leaders, no? As we have here as another important element, leadership, traditional players that can activate traditional non-startup actors to support startups. That's super important, because if you don't have that, you will always stuck, let's say, in your dreams. You need to activate resources that are not available to, let's say, the young, if I may say, and early stage entrepreneur. You need to bring in people that have already had success in business, that have access to resources to grow companies. So for that, you need leadership, and you need to activate more traditional leaders to come in as well.
Cutting edge. I really like that. Are you cutting edge? Do you attract the brightest minds and the best resources? That is quite a challenge, especially for everybody who's like not on the top 10, top 12 list we talk about every quarter in terms of European startup hubs. How can smaller hubs really get the brightest minds, I would assume, for a special purpose here?
Yeah, exactly. It's super important. And I think that's what's most of the time overlooked. Everyone is just assuming they have something to offer and go out into the world, basically promoting their ecosystem and their hub as a great place, without really thinking of what is it that they offer, what they bring to the table. So cutting edge is important, because the average talent or the average top talent is not so interested in just normal, right? So you want to go to the place that is really top notch, that really does something unique, and that can be that they are great in terms of science, but it can also be that they have one of the coolest and most open-minded communities. Now, when people flocked to Berlin, it was not because the Berlin universities were the best, right? But they came because Berlin offered something that felt good, a lifestyle, right?
Rent was cheap.
And it was cheap, yes. So that in a way it was cutting edge as well, because this lifestyle that Berlin offered was cutting edge in the world. Nowhere else could you find the latest trends, be involved in the newest stuff, experiment the most. So I think that is attractive. And if you're a small place, you need to find your cutting edge as well. No? So you need to understand where you have something that can at least in a certain region or in a certain network or vertical attract international talent. And we will see an example now, which is really interesting in that regard, which is Odense in Denmark. It's a small town in Denmark that has developed its cutting edge in the robotics industry. And that's one of the examples of an ecosystem that is really one to learn from.
Mm-hmm. Great. Leadership we already talked about, and community as diverse as possible, right?
Yes, diverse is important because, as we said, if you don't bring in different viewpoints, nothing new can emerge. But also you need to see community not only as, let's say, a meetup space, a place where people come together, but you also need to think of what are the rules that you establish for your community. What makes your community a community? Not just by inviting them every week to the same spot. It's not a community. No? What you want to have is a common set of beliefs. You want to have a common set of standards and behaviors where you say, okay, that is what makes us a community. Now that's how we interact. The classical formulation is pay it forward, right? So that's a classical startup manifesto kind of rule set. And that makes a community. If a community believes in pay it forward, no, first give before you ask, that makes a community. If that's really lived, no? If people really do that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great.
Good. Shall we go a bit to the examples? I already spoke about Odense, so maybe we can dive into it. I really like the place. I think it's really inspiring.
For everybody who doesn't know, Odense is in Denmark. Denmark is just north of Germany, and it's one of the Scandinavian countries, right?
Yes, that's a good question. And I'm always getting confused what is part of Scandinavia and what is not part of Scandinavia. I'm not sure if Denmark counts as Scandinavia.
For me, it counts as Scandinavia. Everybody who has a problem with it, leave comments down here in the show notes. Basically, it's a pretty big peninsula, Denmark, and Odense is in one of the islands between Denmark and Sweden.
Exactly, yeah. And yeah, Odense is a small place, but it has a great robotics cluster. It's really world class in robotics, and they have created a lot of exciting startups. You see here the statistics since 2015 until 2020, there was almost 1 billion euros in investments in robotics companies. Mm-hmm. And that's really a nice result. No? So year over year, they play in the top league in terms of investments into robotic startups. And it all started with a company called Universal Robots. And it was founded by, it's hard to pronounce the last name, so let's stay with the first name. So there were some founders called Esben Ostergaard, Kasper, last name I can't pronounce, and Christian Kassow. And they have created a robotics company. They have IPO'd it. So they brought it to the stock market. It was founded in 2005 and it was sold, so to say, in 2015, 10 years later. And they, with the funds they earned from the exit, they didn't decide to go and buy a yacht and travel the Mediterranean and lie in the sun, but they actually said they wanted to create a robotics cluster to help more startups emerge in the region. And that cluster is actually a public-private initiative, a partnership, and it was first funded by the entrepreneurs and also supported by the government. And since 2015, they have supported the emergence of more and more robotic startups here. And over the time, there was 7 exits and 3 IPOs in that cluster, which is really impressive for a small town that has managed to create such a thriving startup ecosystem. And actually now what they are doing, just as a fun fact, they are now thinking to replicate this model in a new field, which is medical cannabis. So they have identified a new unique value proposition for Odense. Next to robotics, they will go into cannabis. So very excited to see what comes out of that.
Interesting how they're leveraging this from robotics. Anybody would think, yeah, they go into some other aspect of deep tech startups, but going into the medical field, cannabis, that's quite interesting. And if they can really pull it off, there's a lot one can learn about it.
Exactly. And I think it's about being really honest about unique value propositions. Odense has like this agricultural backland where they already had some cannabis cultivation and could build this further up. So they are really analyzing where they stand, and then they are creating more out of it. And I think that's also when we look at, okay, what can we learn from Odense? Now we ask ourselves, if we now start at zero in a different region, now how could we create a mini Odense in our place, let's say? Now, and if we look at the 4 elements that we looked at before, purpose, ecosystem leaders, cutting edge, communities, now, then we find answers in the case study of Odense. Now, the purpose, we want to do everything possible in robotics, right? So this entrepreneurial spirit, this excitement, this focus on robotics, now that is bold. Now, who does that in terms of, if you talk to ecosystem builders, especially if they come from the government, are they really willing to bet everything on one vertical that's even extremely hard to build a startup in? Robotics investments are super, super low all around the world. It's very hard to build startups in this sector. And now betting on that and saying that's our strong horse, that it is bold, but it's a purpose that attracts, of course, stakeholders and entrepreneurs to join in. Exactly. And also this cutting edge, I mean, is the substance they built on. They had the most innovative robotics firm in the region. So they had so many companies focusing on robotics, 292 with 3.74 billion euros in revenue. So I think they have something to offer. So they are really cutting edge. They are not lying about it, right? And I think that's a strong basis for building that ecosystem.
Exactly.
Yes, and I think that it is possible now to understand more closely how ecosystems emerge when you look at these kind of case studies. So maybe another one is the one from my hometown, Munich.
Before we get into Munich, we may piece this a little bit into part 2. So, Thomas, thank you very much for your contribution on how to build a startup hub part 1. And we will be, as we already teased, be back with part 2, the example of Munich.
That's all, folks. Find more news, streams, events, and interviews at www.startuprad.io. Remember, sharing is caring.